Sometimes the worst betrayals come wrapped in love. Sometimes the people we abandon in our pursuit of success are the very ones who made that success possible. And, sometimes, it takes a child's innocent words to shatter the carefully constructed walls we've built around our hearts. What happens when a man who has everything realizes he's lost the one thing that actually mattered? The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Davidson ranch as Marcus Davidson stepped onto the wraparound porch of his mansion. The coffee mug in his weathered hands bore the ranch's logo, a reminder of the empire he'd built from nothing over the past 15 years. At 52, Marcus had everything a man could want. 3,000 acres of prime Texas land, award-winning cattle, a successful business empire, and respect throughout the county. His 8-year-old son Tommy sat on the porch swing, kicking his legs as he waited for their weekly trip to town. The boy's sandy hair caught the morning light, and his bright blue eyes sparkled with excitement. These Saturday outings had become their tradition since Tommy's mother had passed away 3 years ago in a car accident. Or at least, that's what everyone in Millbrook believed. "Ready to go, sport?" Marcus asked, ruffling his son's hair. The resemblance between them was striking, though Tommy had inherited something Marcus had lost long ago, a gentleness that seemed to radiate from within. "Can we get ice cream today, Dad?" Tommy asked, bouncing slightly on the swing. "We'll see," Marcus replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Even in moments like these, his mind wandered to business deals, cattle prices, and the expansion plans for his ranch. Success demanded constant attention, he'd learned that lesson the hard way. They climbed into Marcus's pristine black pickup truck, the leather interior still smelling new despite being 2 years old. As they drove through the gates of the ranch, Tommy pressed his face to the window, watching the countryside roll by. The boy had a curiosity about everything, always asking questions about the world around him. "Dad, tell me again about Mom," Tommy said suddenly, his voice soft. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter. The story he'd told Tommy was carefully crafted, a beautiful fiction about a loving mother who'd died tragically young. In his version, Sarah Davidson had been perfect, a devoted wife and mother who'd supported his dreams until a drunk driver stole her away. "She was wonderful," Marcus said, the practiced words feeling like ash in his mouth. "She loved you more than anything in the world." Tommy nodded solemnly, accepting the story as he always did. He was too young to remember the truth, too innocent to question why there were no photos of his mother in their grand house, why no relatives from her side ever visited, why her grave was always covered in fresh flowers that Marcus never seemed to buy. Millbrook's main street bustled with Saturday morning activity. Marcus parked outside Peterson's hardware store, where he needed to pick up supplies for a fence repair. The town hadn't changed much since he'd first arrived here as a desperate young man with nothing but determination and a pregnant girlfriend named Lisa. Lisa. Even thinking her name sent a sharp pain through his chest, though he'd become expert at pushing such feelings aside. She belonged to his old life, the life before success, before respectability, before he'd transformed himself into Marcus Davidson, respected rancher and pillar of the community. As they walked down the sidewalk, Tommy's hand slipped into his father's. The boy's trust was absolute, his love unconditional. Marcus squeezed the small hand gently, feeling the familiar mixture of protectiveness and guilt that his son's presence always brought. "Mr. Davidson," called out Mrs. Henderson from across the street. She hurried over, her face beaming with the kind of smile reserved for the town's most prominent citizen. "How wonderful to see you and little Tommy." "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Marcus replied politely, automatically switching to his public persona. In town, he was always on, always performing the role of the successful, grieving widower who'd overcome tragedy through hard work and determination. "I wanted to thank you again for your donation to the church fund," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Your generosity knows no bounds." Tommy listened to the conversation with wide eyes, absorbing the respect and admiration everyone showed his father. To him, Marcus Davidson wasn't just dad, he was a local hero, a man who'd built something magnificent from nothing. After completing their errands, they walked toward the park where Tommy could play before they headed home. The morning had grown warmer, and the town was fully awake now. Children played in the distance while their parents chatted on benches. It was the picture of small-town perfection, exactly the kind of life Marcus had dreamed of giving his son. That's when they saw her. She sat on the concrete steps outside the old Woolworth building, her thin frame hunched over a cardboard sign that read "Anything helps. God bless." Her hair, once golden and lustrous, now hung in greasy strands around a face marked by years of hardship. Her clothes were layers of mismatched garments, probably everything she owned, and her shoes were held together with duct tape. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. 15 years melted away in an instant, and he was 25 again, holding a woman who'd believed in him when no one else would, who'd worked double shifts at the diner to support his dreams of starting a ranch, who'd carried his child while he promised her the world. Lisa. His steps faltered, but Tommy didn't notice his father's sudden paralysis. The boy was looking at the woman with the kind of innocent compassion that adults often lose. In his young mind, he simply saw someone who needed help. Marcus tried to steer them away, to cross the street, to avoid the confrontation that would shatter everything he'd built. But Tommy had already noticed the woman struggle to open a water bottle with hands that shook from either hunger or withdrawal. The woman looked up, and their eyes met across the years and the lies and the carefully constructed new identity he'd built. Recognition flickered in her brown eyes, followed quickly by pain so raw it nearly knocked Marcus to his knees. She'd aged hard, the kind of aging that came from sleeping rough and eating from dumpsters and fighting demons both real and imagined. But beneath the grime and the weathered skin and the hollow cheeks, she was still Lisa. Still the woman who'd laughed at his terrible jokes and fallen asleep on his shoulder while he read her books about ranching. Still the woman who'd told him she'd love him forever, no matter what. Forever had turned out to be considerably shorter than either of them had expected. Marcus quickened his pace, practically dragging Tommy along, desperate to escape before his son could notice anything unusual. But children have a way of seeing things adults miss, and Tommy had inherited his father's keen observational skills along with his mother's compassionate heart. "Dad," Tommy said, his voice cutting through Marcus's panic like a blade. "Dad, wait." "Come on, son," Marcus said urgently. "We need to get home." But Tommy had stopped walking. He stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the woman on the steps with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. The boy's face had gone pale, and his grip on his father's hand had tightened. "Dad," Tommy whispered, and something in his voice made Marcus's heart stop. "Dad, that lady." Marcus turned to look at his son, dreading what he might say but unable to stop himself. Tommy's blue eyes were wide with confusion and something that might have been recognition, though that was impossible. The boy had been barely 3 when Marcus had made his choice, too young to remember clearly. "That lady looks sad," Tommy finished, though his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd wanted to say something else entirely. Relief flooded through Marcus, followed immediately by shame. His son's natural empathy was showing, nothing more. There was no way Tommy could recognize Lisa after all these years, especially not in her current condition. "Yes, she does look sad," Marcus managed. "But we can't help everyone, Tommy. Some people have to help themselves." Even as he said the words, they felt like poison in his mouth. He'd helped himself all right, helped himself to a new name, a new identity, and a new story that painted him as the victim rather than the man who'd abandoned a pregnant woman because she wasn't good enough for his ambitious dreams. As they walked away, Marcus didn't look back. He couldn't. But he felt Lisa's eyes on him, felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of her cardboard sign scraping against the concrete as she adjusted it, probably to catch more foot traffic. Tommy was quiet during the rest of their walk to the park, his usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. When they reached the playground, he didn't immediately run off to play as he usually did. Instead, he stood beside his father, looking back toward the main street where they'd left the homeless woman. "Dad," Tommy said carefully, "why don't we help people like that lady?" Marcus knelt down to his son's level, searching for words that wouldn't sound as hollow as they felt. "We do help people, son. We donate to charity, we support the church. But sometimes people end up in situations because of choices they've made." "What kind of choices?" The question was innocent, but it cut deep. What choices had Lisa made except to love a man who'd proven unworthy of that love? What choices except to believe his promises about building a life together? What choices except to carry his child and wait for him to become the man he'd claimed he wanted to be? Adult choices, Marcus said finally. Things you don't need to worry about. Tommy nodded, apparently satisfied with the non-answer. He ran off to the swings, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that his carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. As Tommy played, Marcus found himself remembering the night he'd left. Lisa had been 6 months pregnant, glowing with that particular radiance expectant mothers sometimes had. They'd been living in a tiny apartment above the diner where she worked, saving every penny for their future ranch. The walls had been thin, and they could hear their neighbors fighting, screaming about money and broken dreams. "We're going to be different," Lisa had told him that night, her hand resting on her growing belly. "We're going to make it work." He'd believed her then. Or at least, he'd wanted to. But, when the opportunity came to leave Millbrook for a job that could fast-track his dreams, he'd taken it. He'd told himself it was temporary, that he'd send for her once he was established. He'd convinced himself that starting over somewhere new would be better for all of them. The truth was simpler and uglier. He'd been ashamed of her. Ashamed of their poverty, ashamed of her lack of education, ashamed of the way the successful men he wanted to emulate looked at her when she served them coffee at the diner. When he'd been offered a chance to work for a wealthy rancher in another state, he'd seen it as his opportunity to become someone new. Someone better. Someone who deserved success. The letters had stopped coming after the first year. He'd told himself she'd moved on, found someone better suited to her simple needs. He'd created an entirely new identity as Marcus Davidson, complete with fabricated history and a fictional dead wife named Sarah. When he'd finally returned to Millbrook 15 years later as a wealthy man looking to expand his operations, he'd never expected to find her still here. And he'd certainly never expected to find her like this. "Dad, I'm ready to go," Tommy called out, jarring Marcus from his dark memories. They walked back to the truck in companionable silence, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Tommy kept glancing back toward Main Street, and there was a thoughtfulness in his expression that hadn't been there before. As they drove home, passing familiar landmarks that held memories Marcus would rather forget, Tommy suddenly spoke up. "Dad, what was my real mom's name again?" Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Sarah," he said automatically. "Sarah Davidson." "And she died when I was little?" "Yes, son. In a car accident when you were 3. Tommy nodded slowly, but something in his posture suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. Children had an instinct for truth that adults often underestimated, and Marcus had always been careful to keep their trips to town brief to avoid uncomfortable questions. The rest of the drive passed in silence, both father and son lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached the ranch, Tommy went straight to his room instead of helping with the afternoon chores as he usually did. Marcus found him an hour later, sitting on his bed and staring out the window that faced toward town. "Everything all right, sport?" Marcus asked from the doorway. Tommy turned to look at him with those perceptive blue eyes that sometimes seemed far too old for his 8-year-old face. "Dad, do you think that lady has any kids?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. "I don't know, Tommy." "Why do you ask?" She looked really sad. Like she missed someone. Marcus felt something twist painfully in his chest. Even through her rough appearance and obvious struggles, Lisa's grief was still visible to a child who had never known her. The connection between them transcended the years and the lies and the careful distance Marcus had maintained. "Sometimes adults get sad about things that happened a long time ago," Marcus said carefully. "Like how you get sad about mom sometimes." Marcus nodded, though the comparison felt like another knife to his conscience. His performed grief for the fictional Sarah was nothing compared to the real anguish he'd glimpsed in Lisa's eyes that morning. That night, Marcus stood on his porch looking out over the empire he'd built. The house behind him was magnificent, filled with expensive furniture and all the trappings of success. His land stretched as far as the eye could see, productive and profitable. He had respect, wealth, and a son who adored him. And, for the first time since he'd achieved it all, none of it felt like enough. Marcus Davidson hadn't slept through the night since their trip to town 3 weeks ago. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lisa's face, aged and weathered but unmistakably her. The image haunted him during board meetings, while reviewing cattle reports, and especially during the quiet moments when Tommy asked innocent questions about his mother. The boy had been different since that Saturday, more thoughtful and prone to staring out windows toward town. Marcus caught him several times looking through old photo albums, studying the few pictures Marcus kept of his fictional wife Sarah. They were actually photos of a model from a stock photography website, carefully selected to create a believable story about Tommy's mother. "Dad," Tommy said one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, "can we go visit Mom's grave tomorrow?" Marcus's fork clinked against his plate. They'd visited the elaborate headstone he'd commissioned twice in the past 3 years, both times on the anniversary of Sarah's supposed death. The marble monument was beautiful and completely fake, marking an empty plot with the name of a woman who'd never existed. "Why do you want to visit tomorrow?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Tommy shrugged, kicking his feet against the porch railing. "I keep thinking about her. And about that lady in town. Do you think they would have been friends?" The question was so unexpected, so impossibly perceptive, that Marcus nearly choked on his water. "What makes you ask that?" "I don't know." They both seemed sad. Maybe they would have understood each other. Marcus felt that familiar twist of guilt in his stomach. His 8-year-old son had somehow grasped a truth that Marcus had spent 15 years trying to bury. Lisa and the fictional Sarah would have been friends because they were the same person, separated only by time, circumstance, and Marcus's betrayal. "That's an interesting thought," Marcus managed. "But people who are gone can't be friends with people who are here." Tommy considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "But maybe we could be friends with the lady. Since Mom can't." The simplicity of the suggestion hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. In his son's innocent logic, helping Lisa would be a way to honor his mother's memory. The irony was so profound it took his breath away. "It's not that simple, son," Marcus said weakly. "Why not?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable without revealing truths that would destroy everything. Marcus had built his new life on the premise that some people were worthy of help and others weren't, that success was proof of virtue and poverty was evidence of poor character. Facing Lisa again had shattered those comfortable lies. Over the following days, Marcus found himself driving through town more frequently, always taking routes that passed the Woolworth building. Sometimes Lisa was there, sometimes she wasn't. When he did see her, she looked thinner, more fragile, like a ghost of the vibrant woman who'd once believed in his dreams. He told himself he was just checking on the area, considering properties for expansion. But the truth was more complicated. 15 years of guilt had crystallized into something urgent and painful. Seeing Lisa's condition forced him to confront the direct line between his success and her suffering. The money he'd saved by abandoning her had become the seed capital for his first land purchase. The reputation he'd built on the fiction of being a grieving widower had opened doors and created opportunities. Everything he'd achieved was built on the foundation of her sacrifice. "Mr. Davidson?" His ranch foreman, Jake, appeared at his office door. "You've been staring at that cattle report for 20 minutes without turning a page." Marcus looked up, realizing Jake was right. His mind had been wandering constantly, unable to focus on the business that had once consumed his every waking moment. "Just thinking through some decisions," Marcus said, closing the folder. "Jake, what do you know about the homeless situation in town?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Not much. Mrs. Patterson at the bank mentioned seeing more folks down on their luck lately." "Why?" "Just wondering if there's something the ranch could do to help. Community involvement, that sort of thing." It was a plausible excuse, the kind of philanthropic gesture that would enhance his reputation while serving his actual purpose. Jake nodded approvingly, probably thinking this was another calculated move to increase the Davidson Ranch's standing in the community. "I could ask around, see what the churches are doing," Jake offered. "Good idea. Also, see if you can find out about specific individuals who might need assistance. Particularly anyone who's been in the area for a long time." That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that terrified him. He drove to town with the stated purpose of meeting with his lawyer about property acquisitions, but his real destination was the Woolworth building. He needed to see Lisa up close, to understand exactly what 15 years of abandonment had done to her. She was there, sitting in her usual spot with her cardboard sign. But today something was different. She was coughing violently, a deep, rattling sound that spoke of serious illness. Her face was flushed with fever, and she swayed slightly even while sitting down. Marcus parked across the street and watched, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Several people passed by without acknowledging her presence, their eyes sliding past her as if she were part of the architecture. A few dropped coins into the coffee can beside her, but no one stopped to actually look at her, to see the person beneath the circumstances. When a particularly violent coughing fit left her gasping for breath, Marcus found himself getting out of the truck before he'd consciously decided to move. His feet carried him across the street, driven by an impulse stronger than his fear of exposure. "Excuse me," he said, approaching carefully. "Are you all right?" Lisa looked up at him, and he saw the exact moment recognition flickered in her fever-bright eyes. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The years collapsed between them, and he was looking at the woman who'd once traced patterns on his chest while they planned their future together. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing and disuse. "I wondered if you'd ever speak to me." The simple statement contained no accusation, no anger, just a tired acknowledgement of the elephant that had been sitting between them for weeks. Her acceptance of his coldness somehow made it worse than any anger would have. "You're sick," he said, stating the obvious because he couldn't figure out how to say anything else. "Just a cold," she replied, though they both knew it was more than that. "Comes with the territory." Marcus looked at her more closely, seeing details he'd missed from a distance. Her clothes were clean but worn through in places. Her shoes were definitely held together with tape, and her sign was written in careful, precise handwriting that reminded him of the poetry she used to write in the margins of her notebooks. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Lisa's laugh turned into another coughing fit. When she recovered, she gestured weakly at the nearly empty coffee can. "Breakfast, maybe. Not much lunch money today." Marcus reached for his wallet without thinking, then stopped. Throwing money at her felt wrong, like trying to buy absolution for 15 years of abandonment. But she needed help, and his guilt didn't matter more than her immediate suffering. He pulled out $200 bills and placed them in her can. Lisa stared at the money as if it were a mirage. "You don't have to," she said quietly. "I know you have your own life now. Your own family." The words cut deep because they carried no resentment, only resignation. She'd accepted his abandonment so completely that his basic human kindness now seemed like charity from a stranger. "Everyone deserves to eat," Marcus said, the words feeling inadequate. Lisa nodded slowly, then looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding. "Your boy seems nice. He has your eyes but, kinder." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "You've seen him?" "I see everyone who walks down this street, Marcus. It's my office, you might say." Her voice carried a trace of the dry humor he remembered. "He looks at people differently than you do. Sees them instead of looking through them." The observation was achingly accurate. Tommy did have a way of seeing people, really seeing them, that Marcus had lost somewhere in his climb to respectability. "He's a good kid," Marcus said, unsure why he was continuing this conversation. "He looks like he was when he was little. Before." Lisa trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging between them. "Before you left us. Before you chose success over family. Before you decided we weren't good enough for your dreams." "Lisa," Marcus began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "You don't owe me explanations, Marcus. We both know what happened. I just want you to know that I don't blame you. You did what you thought you had to do." Her forgiveness was somehow worse than hatred would have been. It suggested she'd spent the past 15 years not consumed with anger but with the kind of self-blame that made people think they deserved whatever happened to them. "I should go," Marcus said, backing away from a conversation that was stripping away too many layers of his carefully constructed defenses. "Of course," Lisa replied. Thank you for the money. And, Marcus? Take care of that boy. He's special. As Marcus walked back to his truck, he felt like he was moving through water. Every step was an effort, every breath a struggle. Behind him, he could hear Lisa's cough starting again, the sound following him across the street and into his vehicle. The drive home passed in a blur of guilt and memory. When he arrived at the ranch, Tommy was waiting on the porch with his homework spread across the small table they'd set up for afternoon study sessions. "Hey, Dad," Tommy called out. "How was town?" "Fine," Marcus replied automatically, then stopped himself. His son deserved better than automatic responses and half-truths. "Actually, I met someone who reminded me of your mother." Tommy looked up with sudden interest. "Really? What were they like?" Marcus sat down beside his son, studying the homework problems spread across the table. Math worksheets and reading assignments, the normal concerns of an 8-year-old boy who had no idea his entire life was built on a foundation of lies. "She was sick," Marcus said carefully. "And alone. It made me think about how important it is to take care of people we love while we have the chance." Tommy considered this with his usual seriousness. "Is that why you always make sure I eat my vegetables and brush my teeth?" Marcus smiled despite the weight in his chest. "Partly, yes. Because once someone is gone, you can't take care of them anymore. But you could take care of other people instead. Like that lady we saw." The connection Tommy made was so direct, so obvious, that Marcus wondered how he'd managed to avoid it for so long. His son understood instinctively what Marcus had spent 15 years trying to forget, that people were people, regardless of their circumstances, and that love expressed through action was the only kind that mattered. That evening, as Marcus tucked Tommy into bed, the boy asked a question that stopped his heart. "Dad, what if Mom isn't really dead?" Marcus sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if she got lost somehow, and we could find her? Wouldn't that be better than visiting a grave?" The innocence of the question was devastating. Tommy wasn't suspicious of his father's story, he was hopeful. He was imagining a world where his mother could be rescued, where love could triumph over separation and loss. "That would be wonderful," Marcus said honestly. "But sometimes people get lost in ways that mean they can't come back to who they used to be." "But they could still be helped, right? Even if they're different?" Marcus looked into his son's trusting eyes and felt something break open in his chest. The boy was offering him a path toward redemption without even knowing it. Tommy's capacity for love and acceptance was showing him what he'd lost when he'd chosen ambition over loyalty. "Yes," Marcus whispered. "They could still be helped." Tommy smiled and settled back into his pillow, apparently satisfied with this answer. But Marcus sat in the darkened room long after his son fell asleep, staring out the window toward the lights of town and thinking about second chances. The next morning brought news that shattered Marcus's already fragile peace of mind. Jake knocked on his office door with an expression that immediately put Marcus on alert. "Boss, you know that community outreach you were asking about?" Jake said. "Well, I talked to Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church. Seems there's a woman in town, been living rough for years. She's in bad shape, pneumonia probably. They're trying to get her medical attention." Marcus felt the world tilt around him. "What woman?" "Don't know her name. She hangs around downtown, been there for years apparently. Pastor says she won't go to the shelter, won't accept most help. But she's real sick now, might not have much choice." The room seemed to spin as Marcus processed this information. Lisa was dying, slowly and alone, just as she'd lived for the past 15 years. The pneumonia would explain the coughing, the fever, the increasing weakness he'd noticed. "Where is she now?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice level. "Hospital, I think. Pastor Williams was heading over there when I talked to him." Marcus stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward. "I need to go to town. Handle things here until I get back." Jake looked surprised but nodded. "Everything okay, boss?" "No," Marcus replied honestly. "Nothing's okay. Marcus drove to the hospital with his heart pounding against his ribs. The Millbrook General Hospital was small, serving the rural community with basic medical services and a handful of dedicated doctors. He donated money for their new wing 2 years ago, another calculated gesture to enhance his reputation. Now he wondered if Lisa would end up in a room paid for with money that should have been hers all along. At the information desk, a young volunteer looked up his name in the computer system and directed him to the 3rd floor. Marcus took the elevator, his hands sweating despite the air conditioning. What was he going to say? How could he explain his presence without revealing their history? The 3rd floor was quiet, with the antiseptic smell of hospital disinfectant and the soft beeping of machines. Marcus approached the nurse's station, where a middle-aged woman in scrubs looked up expectantly. "I'm here about the woman who was brought in today," Marcus said. "The one Pastor Williams mentioned." The nurse's expression softened. "Are you a relative?" "We've been trying to find family or friends." Marcus hesitated for a moment that felt like an eternity. "I'm someone who wants to help." "Is she all right?" "She's stable for now, but it's serious. Pneumonia complicated by malnutrition and exposure. Her immune system is compromised." The nurse studied Marcus's expensive clothes and confident bearing. "Are you with one of the local charities?" "Something like that," Marcus replied. "Can I see her?" The nurse glanced around, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "She's in room 314. But she's been sedated, so she might not be very responsive. The doctor says the next few days will be critical." Room 314 was at the end of a quiet hallway. Marcus stood outside the door for several minutes, his hand frozen on the handle. Beyond this door lay 15 years of consequences, the physical manifestation of choices he'd made and paths he'd taken. Once he walked through, there would be no more pretending, no more careful distance between his new life and his old one. Lisa looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by machines and medical equipment. Her hair had been washed and braided by one of the nurses, revealing the bone structure that had once made her beautiful. Without the layers of survival clothing, she looked fragile and young, like the 20-year-old girl who'd fallen asleep in his arms while he read her poetry. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, studying her face. The years had been hard on her, carving lines of worry and hardship around her eyes. But her expression in sleep was peaceful, and for a moment he could see traces of the woman who'd laughed at his terrible jokes and believed in impossible dreams. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her unconscious form. "I'm so sorry for everything." Her breathing was shallow but steady, assisted by an oxygen tube under her nose. The steady beep of monitors provided a mechanical rhythm to his whispered confession. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus told the complete truth about what had happened, about his cowardice and selfishness, about the empire he'd built on the foundation of her sacrifice. He told her about Tommy, about the boy's kindness and curiosity, about how he'd inherited the best parts of both his parents despite growing up with only one. He told her about the fake grave and the fictional wife, about the elaborate lies that had become his reality. And he told her about the moment 3 weeks ago when their eyes had met across the street, when he'd realized that all his success meant nothing if it came at the cost of his soul. "Sir?" A gentle voice interrupted his confession. Marcus turned to see a young doctor standing in the doorway. "I'm Dr. Martinez. Are you family?" Marcus stood up, his mind racing. This was the moment of decision, the point where he could either continue the lie or take the first step toward redemption. "I'm Marcus Davidson," he said. "I'd like to take responsibility for her medical care." Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Are you a relative?" "I'm someone who should have been taking care of her all along," Marcus replied, the words feeling strange but true in his mouth. The doctor studied him for a moment, perhaps recognizing the name from hospital donation plaques. "Mr. Davidson, I appreciate your generosity, but we need to know about her medical history, her emergency contacts, her insurance situation." "Do you have that information?" Marcus realized how little he actually knew about Lisa's life over the past 15 years. Had she been married? Did she have other children? Had she tried to find him? The questions highlighted the depth of his abandonment, the completeness with which he'd severed their connection. "I'll find out whatever you need to know," Marcus said. "Cost isn't a concern. I want her to have the best possible care." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. "The pneumonia is serious, but treatable. The bigger concern is her overall health. Chronic malnutrition, exposure, stress. Her body has been under siege for years. Even if we clear the infection, she'll need extensive rehabilitation." "Whatever it takes," Marcus said immediately. After the doctor left, Marcus remained beside Lisa's bed, thinking about the conversation he would need to have with Tommy. His son deserves the truth, but how could an 8-year-old understand the complexities of adult failure and redemption? As afternoon faded to evening, Pastor Williams arrived. He was a kind-faced man in his 60s, someone Marcus had met at various community functions but never spoken with extensively. "Mr. Davidson," Pastor Williams said, looking surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I heard about her situation," Marcus replied carefully. "I wanted to help." Pastor Williams nodded approvingly. "That's very generous of you. Lisa has been part of our community for years, though she keeps to herself mostly. She's never asked for much, just the occasional meal or place to get warm." "Lisa," Marcus repeated, as if hearing her name from someone else made her more real. "That's what she told me her name was. She's never mentioned family, but sometimes I've caught her watching the children play in the park. Always from a distance, like she was remembering something." The image of Lisa watching other children play while her own son grew up without her hit Marcus like a physical blow. How many times had she seen him and Tommy together in town? How many times had she witnessed the life that could have been hers? "Pastor," Marcus said carefully, "what do you know about her history?" Pastor Williams sat down in the other visitor's chair. "Not much. She appeared in town about 12 years ago, already in rough shape. I've tried to reach out over the years, but she's always been very private. Polite, but private. Sometimes I wonder if she's protecting someone by staying away. 12 years ago. Tommy would have been born around that time." Marcus felt a chill as he realized Lisa had probably returned to Millbrook when their son was born, perhaps hoping to reconnect or at least to be close to her child. Instead, she'd found him living as a supposedly grieving widower, unreachable behind walls of wealth and fictitious tragedy. That night, Marcus called his housekeeper and arranged for her to stay late with Tommy. He couldn't leave Lisa alone in the hospital, though he couldn't entirely explain why even to himself. Partly it was guilt, but partly it was something deeper. Sitting beside her bed, he felt more like himself than he had in years. Around midnight, Lisa's eyes fluttered open. She looked around the room in confusion before her gaze settled on Marcus. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "This is unexpected," she said, her voice hoarse but clearer than it had been on the street. "You're very sick," Marcus replied, unsure how to begin the conversation they needed to have. Lisa tried to sit up, then fell back against the pillows with a weak laugh. "I suppose I am. Are you here officially? Marcus Davidson, pillar of the community, visiting the local vagrant?" Her tone was gentle, not accusing, but it highlighted the absurdity of their situation. The wealthy rancher keeping vigil beside the homeless woman, their shared history invisible to the world. "I'm here because I owe you more than I can ever repay," Marcus said. Lisa studied his face in the dim light from the hallway. "You don't owe me anything, Marcus. You made your choice 15 years ago. I made mine by staying." "What choice did you make by staying?" "You could have left Millbrook, started over somewhere else." "I could have," Lisa agreed. "But I kept thinking he might want to know his mother someday. Even from a distance." The simple statement contained multitudes of sacrifice and hope. Lisa had spent 15 years living rough in the town where her son grew up, content to be a distant witness to his life rather than absent entirely. While Marcus had been building his empire and crafting his new identity, she'd been choosing love over comfort, proximity over escape. "Tommy," Marcus said, and Lisa's eyes immediately sharpened. "Is that his name?" "I always wondered, but I never wanted to get close enough to find out for sure." Marcus felt tears he hadn't shed in years burning behind his eyes. He's a good boy. Kind, like you were. Like you are. He looks happy, Lisa said softly. That matters more than anything else. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, years of separation bridged by their shared concern for the child neither of them really knew anymore. Finally, Marcus spoke the words that had been building in his chest for weeks. I want to tell him the truth. Lisa's eyes widened. Marcus, no. Your life, his life, they're settled. Don't destroy that because of guilt. It's not guilt, Marcus said, though that wasn't entirely true. He deserves to know his real mother. And, you deserve to know your son. Lisa shook her head weakly. Look at me, Marcus. I'm not mother material anymore. I'm sick, I'm homeless, I have nothing to offer him but complications. You have love to offer him. And he has so much love to give that it might heal us all. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse checking Lisa's vitals and adjusting her for. After the nurse left, Lisa stared at the ceiling for a long time before speaking. If you tell him, everything changes. Your reputation, your standing in the community, your carefully constructed life. Are you ready for that? Marcus thought about his mansion, his successful business, his position as a respected community leader. All of it built on lies and maintained by continued deception. For the first time, the prospect of losing it all felt less terrifying than the thought of living with the lies forever. Maybe it's time for everything to change, he said. The next morning, Marcus drove home to find Tommy eating breakfast on the porch, his usual weekend tradition. The boy looked up expectantly, and Marcus realized this might be the last morning Tommy would look at him with uncomplicated trust and admiration. Dad, you were gone really early, Tommy observed. Is everything okay? Marcus sat down beside his son, gathering courage for the most important conversation of his life. Tommy, I need to tell you something very important. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Tommy put down his cereal spoon, sensing the gravity in his father's voice. Are you sick? No, son. But someone else is. Someone very important. Marcus took a deep breath and began to tell the story he'd hidden for 8 years. He told Tommy about Lisa, about how they'd loved each other when they were young, about how Tommy was born from that love. He told him about his own cowardice and selfishness, about the fake mother and the real one who'd been living on the streets just minutes away from their comfortable life. Tommy listened without interruption, his young face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and, finally, a kind of understanding that seemed too mature for his years. So the lady on the street, Tommy said carefully, she's my real mom? Yes, Marcus whispered. And she's been there all this time? Yes. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing information that would have challenged an adult. When he finally spoke, his words surprised Marcus with their clarity. Can we go see her now? The drive to the hospital felt like a journey between worlds. Tommy sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally asking practical questions about Lisa's illness or how long she'd been in Millbrook. He didn't ask why Marcus had lied, which somehow made the guilt worse. At the hospital, Marcus felt his nervousness increase with each step toward room 314. What if Lisa was too weak for visitors? What if seeing Tommy caused her more pain? What if 8 years was too long to bridge? Tommy walked beside him with the kind of determined stride Marcus recognized from his own personality. When they reached the room, Marcus stopped his son gently. Tommy, she's very sick. And, seeing you might be overwhelming for her. We need to be very gentle. Tommy nodded solemnly, then surprised Marcus by taking his hand. It's okay, Dad. Sometimes people need time to get used to good things. They entered the room together, and Marcus watched Lisa's face as she saw Tommy for the first time up close. Her expression was wonder mixed with terror, joy complicated by 15 years of loss. Tommy approached the bed without hesitation, as if he'd been visiting his sick mother his whole life. Hi, he said simply. I'm Tommy. Are you feeling better? Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the boy who had her smile and Marcus's stubborn chin. A little better, yes. Thank you for asking. Dad told me you're my real mom, Tommy continued with the directness that only children possessed. He said you've been sick and alone for a long time. That must have been really hard. The simple acknowledgement of her suffering, offered without judgment or complexity, broke through Lisa's careful emotional control. She began to cry, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of being seen and accepted by the child she'd never stopped loving. I've thought about you every single day, she whispered. I've been thinking about you too, Tommy replied. I just didn't know who you were yet. Marcus watched from the doorway as his son climbed carefully onto the hospital bed beside Lisa, instinctively offering the physical comfort she'd been denied for so long. The sight of them together, mother and son finally reunited, was both heartbreaking and healing. Over the following weeks, everything Marcus had built began to unravel, just as Lisa had predicted. The truth came out gradually, spreading through Millbrook's tight-knit community like wildfire. The respected widower was revealed to be a man who'd abandoned his pregnant girlfriend and constructed an elaborate fiction to hide his shame. Some people were outraged, calling for boycotts of his business and demanding his removal from various civic positions. Others were more understanding, recognizing the complexity of young love and misguided ambition. But everyone had an opinion about Marcus Davidson's spectacular fall from grace. Marcus found that he cared less than he'd expected. His main concern was Tommy's adjustment and Lisa's recovery. The boy handled the situation with remarkable resilience, splitting his time between home and the hospital as Lisa slowly regained her strength. The relationship between mother and son developed gradually, built on shared stories and small kindnesses. Lisa's recovery was slow but steady. Good nutrition, medical care, and, most importantly, hope, worked their magic on her damaged body. As her physical health improved, Marcus began to see glimpses of the woman he'd fallen in love with 20 years earlier. Her sense of humor returned, along with her intelligence and her remarkable capacity for forgiveness. The hardest conversation came 6 weeks after their reunion, when Lisa was well enough to be discharged from the hospital. Marcus had arranged for a small apartment in town, furnished and paid for, but Lisa wasn't sure she wanted to accept such an elaborate gesture. I don't want charity, she said as they sat in the hospital garden. And I don't want you to think this erases the past. It's not charity, Marcus replied. It's child support, 15 years overdue. And it doesn't erase anything. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to build something better going forward. Tommy, who had been listening to the adult conversation with his usual seriousness, suddenly spoke up. Why can't you just both live at our house? The suggestion was so innocent, so logical, that both adults were struck speechless. In Tommy's world, people who loved each other lived together and took care of each other. The complexities of adult relationships and social expectations didn't factor into his simple equation. It's not that simple, sweetie, Lisa said gently. Why not? Tommy persisted. We have lots of rooms. And Dad said the most important thing is taking care of people we love. Marcus felt his heart stop as he realized his son was right. Somewhere in his journey toward respectability, he'd lost sight of the fundamental truth that love expressed through action was the only kind that mattered. Social conventions and community expectations were meaningless compared to the opportunity to build a real family with the people who mattered most. Maybe Tommy has a point, Marcus said quietly. Maybe simple is exactly what we need. Lisa looked between father and son, seeing the hope in both their faces. For the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included stability, family, and love. Are you sure? She asked. I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago. Neither am I, Marcus replied. But maybe that's good. Maybe we're both better now than we were then. 6 months later, Marcus Davidson walked down the main street of Millbrook with his wife Lisa and his son Tommy. They stopped at the ice cream parlor where Tommy ordered his usual chocolate cone and Lisa discovered a love of strawberry sundaes. Some people stared, some whispered, but most just saw what they were, a family that had found its way back to each other. Marcus had kept the ranch but sold the mansion, moving his family into a comfortable farmhouse where love mattered more than luxury. His business reputation had suffered, but his personal relationships had never been stronger. Tommy thrived having both his parents together, and Lisa gradually found her place in a community that had known her only as a homeless woman. The fake headstone marking Sarah Davidson's grave was quietly removed and replaced with a memorial bench dedicated to second chances. On warm evenings, the family would sometimes sit there and watch the sunset, grateful for the long road that had brought them home to each other. Marcus never forgot the lesson his son had taught him on that first day in town, that people were people regardless of their circumstances, and that love expressed through action was the only kind that mattered. He'd spent 15 years learning that success without love was just expensive loneliness. But some lessons, he discovered, were worth the wait.